Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for the reading of your word. God, I pray that you would speak to us this morning, that you would be lifted up, that your name would be made known, that you would be evidenced as we unpack the text this morning. We want to have open hearts and open minds to hear from you. And as we do, our hearts and lives would be changed evermore into your likeness, Jesus. We pray this in your name. Amen. So I am not enough. I am is enough. This idea that we don't have to find our identity in striving to try to measure up in ourselves, but we can know the one who is all sufficient, and that is the great I am. We've been looking at the book of Exodus and kind of walking through this idea. And that language of I am is enough, it comes from a story in Exodus where God spoke to Moses. And he said, I want you to go to Egypt and set the Israelites free who had been in slavery. And in that encounter, Moses kind of gives these excuses and he has these questions. He said, well, who do I tell them is sending me? And God says, I am who I am. That's who's sending you. And it's this reality that God is self-sufficient. He is all-powerful. He's not dependent upon any other thing. And that we, in and of ourselves, we can't measure up. We can't strive and do to try to measure up and be enough. But we can know the one who is enough, who is the great I am. And in him, we can be enough. And last week, Pastor Tar did such a great job of kind of bringing the word, sharing about this idea of being on the long journey with God. And so this morning, we're into the next passage in Exodus 14, what I'm just simply calling Deliverance at the Red Sea. And just to give a little context from last week to this week, Moses went to Pharaoh. He said, let my people go. Pharaoh said, no, I'm not going to do it. God sends these 10 plagues upon Egypt. And finally, after Pharaoh's firstborn son dies, Pharaoh's finally like, all right, I'm going to let the Israelites go. And he releases them, and they march out of Egypt. Finally, after over 400 years of slavery in Egypt, the Israelites leave Egypt, and they're free until you come to the next chapter. And so when they march out of Egypt, they come to a place right before the Red Sea. It's, if you looked at a map, you could see it. And they open up camp there right before the Red Sea. Well, in the meantime, after they leave Egypt, Pharaoh and his officials are like, what have we done? We just lost our servants. We just lost all our services. We need to go get them back. And so Pharaoh, he brings his army and his horsemen and his chariots and his troops, and they march out after the Israelites, and they overtake them as they're camped there at the Red Sea in pursuit of them. And so here's this scenario for Israel. This situation that they find themselves in, they're stuck. Because on the one side, they have the Red Sea, which they can't get by. And on the other side is this Egyptian army that has now come after them. And they are stuck in camp there at the Red Sea. They're in trouble. They don't have any options. They don't have anywhere to go. They can't go this way, and they can't go that way. It's this phrase that we have, right? Stuck between a rock and a hard place. Like that was their reality. They didn't have an option out. I wonder how many times we find ourselves at the Red Sea. I would guess that there's people in here this morning that you feel like you're kind of at a Red Sea moment in your life where you feel stuck. You don't see a way forward, but you don't see a way back either. Just like the Israelites, you're stuck at the Red Sea and you don't know what to do. And I feel like there's some really good lessons that came out of this text. This is a story I've heard my whole life. I grew up in the church, heard it my whole life. And yet, as I was studying for this morning, man, God was just revealing some fresh things to me of what things can we learn about this Red Sea experience? And what does it mean for us as we encounter those Red Sea moments in our lives? Well, the first thing I would say is this. And we're going to move through these because this is more than a 3-point message. I'm just going to let you know on the front end. So if you take notes, you got to make room for more than 3. But the first thing is the Red Sea tempts us to prefer the stability of captivity over the uncertainty of deliverance. I'm going to read that again. The Red Sea tempts us to prefer the stability of captivity over the uncertainty of deliverance. And I want to look at verse 11 and 12 again, because Israel's camped there at the Red Sea, the Egyptian army comes, and the Israelites cry out to Moses, and this is what they say. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the desert. And the Red Sea tempts us to prefer the stability of captivity over the possibility of freedom and deliverance. They found themselves stuck and afraid, and they didn't know what to do. And here's this army, and suddenly Egypt doesn't sound so bad. It's like their minds started playing some mental gymnastics here, and they revised the history over 400 years of brutal captivity. And they're like, we should have just stayed there. That's what we prefer, rather than the possibility of deliverance. I can remember during the time that we were serving as missionaries in Russia, my wife and I, shortly after we were there, we had a chance to talk with some Russians just to hear a little bit about the history for those that lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And there was this one woman, her name was Natasha, and she was just a girl in 1991, and she shared this story about what that experience was like in those early days. Now, for us as Americans, we learned in history about the Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet Union, and from our perspective, where it's like, freedom and democracy and, just how bad that was because it was control and communism, to hear her perspective was very interesting. Because in my mind, I thought when the Soviet Union fell, the common Russian was finally free. They could now choose what they would do, choose how they spent their time, choose how they spent their money, what their occupations would be. They had these freedoms suddenly. Everyone would be so happy. And she shared this story about how right when it happened, like the economy just fell out. And the currency lost all value, and it was very scary for Russians. They had nothing all of a sudden. And in those moments, in those early days, they actually preferred the strong, dominant hand of communist rule over the uncertainty of stepping into the unknown of the freedoms that they now had. And they endured some really bad leaders like Lenin, but then also like the dictator of Joseph Stalin. And yet in the midst of fear and uncertainty and instability, they were longing for the strong hand of stability that didn't give them the freedoms that they wanted. Yes, they were told what jobs they had to do, but when it ended, there was just so much fear and uncertainty, they wanted to go back. I mean, that was one person's experience, but that's what we see with the Israelites as well here. Suddenly, Egypt doesn't seem so bad. Pharaoh may not be such a bad guy. I like the way one commentary said it. It said, when hardship is encountered, the miserable past suddenly looks like the good old days. The Israelites were simply thinking the way most people think of the past when the present seems unbearable. You ever been there? Where you find yourself stuck in a situation, you don't know what to do, you're afraid, and suddenly the previous days that you wanted to be out of don't look so bad now. And you find yourselves wanting to go back. Yes, it might mean stepping back into that unhealthy relationship. It might mean you're stepping back into addictive behaviors. It might mean you're going back to a job that you know you're not supposed to be in. It might mean that you're going back to acting and speaking ways that you shouldn't. It might mean you're not stepping into the ways that God is leading you, but it feels safe because it's comfortable and that's what you know. And so you find yourself longing for those days when God is trying to bring you out to something better, because that's captivity. He's trying to bring you out into something new. That's not God's best for you. So when we face the Red Sea, we can feel very tempted to desire the stability of our past, which isn't good for us, to be stuck in that over the possibility of being delivered into freedom. And so the Israelites cry out, "Take us back to Egypt," because we don't see a way out. We're stuck between the Red Sea and this army that has come after us. And Moses responds with, I think, just this amazing response that we find here. Verse 13. In the midst of them calling out, Moses said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." And Moses gives such a good word for us when we find ourselves in the midst of the Red Sea. The Red Sea invites us to rest in the deliverance of God instead of striving in our own strength. You see, in this text, the Israelites, when they find themselves stuck, they find themselves wanting to try to figure this out on their own. And the invitation is, you don't have to figure it out on your own. God, through Moses, gives the Israelites 3 instructions. He says, do not be afraid, stand firm, and be still. Those are really hard instructions when you're in the midst of feeling stuck without a way out. Do not be afraid, stand firm, and be still. And I think that last one can be particularly hard. Because when we find ourselves stuck in a situation where we don't see a way out, our natural tendency is we start to scheme and we start to plan and we start to try to make sure that we figure out a way that we're going to get out of this. We're just going to do it on our own power and we're going to push our way through no matter what it takes because we can't stay here. And so I have to find a way out of this. Man, isn't that so common, our response? I'm just going to figure it out. And I'm going to manipulate, and if I could just say this thing, or do this thing, or manipulate this scenario, or talk to this person, or figure out a different timeline, but I'm going to figure it out somehow. But the problem is that it leaves God out of the equation when we do that. So often when we face those times in our lives where we literally feel like there is no possibilities available, man, that is fertile ground for God to show up in powerful ways. I remember my mom telling me a story when my sister and I have one older sister. My sister and I were kids growing up as missionaries in Zambia, and because of the circumstances of education, we were actually homeschooled when we were there. But the plan was always, by the time we reached high school, we were going to go off to Kenya to a boarding school, an international Christian school. And it was very difficult to get into this school, not because it was like some elite school or it was like, academically rigorous or anything, but just because there were so many that were trying to get in, the wait list was very long. And so if you wanted to get in at a certain year, you needed to put your name on the list years in advance. And my sister was getting ready to enter high school, and they had put her name on the list, but she was not accepted. And my mom told me the story as an adult, just sharing, they did not know what they were going to do. Like, there was no plan B option available. And they had put her name on the list, they had filled out all the paperwork, they had talked to all the people that they needed to talk to, and she wasn't accepted, and they did not know what they were going to do in this situation. There was no path forward. And she tells me this story about how in those very vulnerable moments, her mind just started going. And she began to think, I wonder how I can change this situation. I wonder what I can tweak or adjust or manipulate. Maybe I can talk to this person again, but I can say things in a different way this time. Maybe I can just tweak the scenario a little bit. If I can just, get a word in or talk to a different person, and it became this thing of like, I want to manipulate and try to scheme to figure this out. And in those moments, God's Spirit convicted her heart in a really deep way. And God said, no, you need to stop. You need to be still and to see what I'm going to do. And I'll just tell you, like, she ended up getting in, but it had nothing to do with anything that my mom did. It reminds me of that verse in Psalm 46, verse 10 and 11. God says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." And my mom released it to the Lord in those moments. And she didn't have a guarantee when she did of what was going to happen. But she knew that she was being invited into obedience to see how God might work. Listen, when you face the Red Sea, God doesn't want you striving in your own strength to try to figure your way out of it. Because that's the temptation. And it can range from outward aggressive action to very subtle manipulation and scheming. Whatever it takes to figure it out. And God is inviting us to a better way. He said, "Be still. Be still. The Lord will fight for you." It is a counterintuitive invitation. That at the point of wanting to do and wanting to strive to solve the problem, the invitation is be still and rest to see God at work. And you know, one of the reasons why we can actually do this, why we can rest and see God at work, is because of who God is. Like, God is a good God. God is a powerful God. God is a reliable God. God is a God who cares about his people and he cares about their situations. God is a trustworthy God. He's a faithful God. And so when you look at what happens next, as you continue to read the story, you come to verse 19. It says, "Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long." I said one of the reasons why we can actually rest in God in the midst of those moments is because of his character. Well, here we see it playing out. God was caring for his people. Well, let me say it this way. The Red Sea evidences God's faithfulness to his promises and his care for us. To understand what's taking place here, you actually have to jump back to the end of the last chapter, chapter 13. After they left Egypt, Israel was traveling, and God sends this pillar of cloud to guide Israel by day and a pillar of fire to guide them by night. So they can travel by day or by night. And so you see God's presence leading his people out, providing for them. And the same is true when trouble hits. As the Israelites find themselves stuck between the Red Sea and this Egyptian army, the God who was leading them along the way now moves behind them and creates this division, this barrier, this separation, protecting them from this army. It was a visual reminder of God's promised presence to them, that the one who is their guide is also their protector. Listen, when we're at the Red Sea, God doesn't leave us on our own to fend for ourselves. We have one who cares for us. He fights our battles. And in the midst of it, you can be assured that he is faithful to who he says he is. And he's faithful to his promises. And I could tell you story after story in my own life of where God has proven himself to me time and again. And the longer I walk with the Lord, and I have faced some Red Sea moments, I can tell you time and time again, he has not failed, and he has cared for me. We have the promise of his presence. He said, "I will always be with you." And the beautiful story of what the Bible is God telling his people over and over again, "I will be with you. I will be with you. I will be with you." Deuteronomy 31:8, "The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." Jesus gave the commission to his disciples. He said, "And surely I am with you always, even to the end of the age." His Holy Spirit dwells within us. His presence is with us. Listen, no matter what Red Sea experience you may be facing, God will be faithful to his promises because he is a promise keeper and he cares for you. Your Red Sea gives opportunity for God to show you just how faithful he is. There's one other thing that we see taking place here, and I don't want us to miss it. Because up to this point, the Israelites actually haven't moved anywhere. Like, they're still stuck between the Red Sea and this Egyptian army. Like, we haven't moved yet. And then you come to verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand with the staff over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Can you imagine what this would have been like? Moses stretches out his hand, and this strong wind comes, and this sea that is before you, suddenly those waters begin to divide. And the water begins to pile up into these two giant walls on either side. And there is your path forward. It's crazy to think about. And just to kind of help give us a visual, like the language that's used here in this text, when it talks about like a wall of water, like that language was only used when it was talking about high walls, like big city walls. It wasn't like little retaining walls. The imagery is giant walls of water. It's funny, my wife, who knew I was preaching on this text, showed me this picture that somebody had sent about, when you're reading the kids' Bibles growing up, you have these pictures of Moses and his people and the walls, kind of splashing up a little bit. But then it had some AI-generated images from the text of what it looked like, and it was just like fascinating because the water is giant on each side. Go look at some AI-generated pictures of this text. Like, there was a significant, miraculous work that was taking place here. God was making a way to deliver his people. But here's the thing. Just because a path or a way is presented to you, you still have to take a step and go down it. Like, I don't know about you, but if I was one of those Israelites seeing this, I would have felt a little nervous, right? Like, this miraculous thing is opened up before you. Like, just channel your inner Israelite emotions right now. I feel like nervous would be an understatement. And God is saying, this is your path to deliverance. You see, just like the Israelites, for us in our lives, the Red Sea challenges us to experience deliverance as we take steps of faith. In God's timing, their deliverance didn't come by staying there at the water when they separated. They closed up the camp. Their deliverance came as they stepped through the waters in faith and walked through the sea. It reminds me of another story that we see in the Bible. It's in the New Testament, the book of Luke. Jesus encounters 10 lepers. And in this chapter 17, verse 11, it says, "Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, 'Jesus, Master, have pity on us.' When he saw them, he said, 'Go, show yourselves to the priests.'" Now get this. "And as they went, they were cleansed." We can't miss that. Jesus said, "Go." And it says, as they went, they were cleansed, not before. It's like that phrase that comes to mind, you can't steer a parked car. You can't drive a parked car. You see, for some of you, you may find yourself stuck, and God is presenting a path forward. And for whatever reason, you don't want to take that step out into it. Because taking that step can be scary. Like, we can own that. It can be scary. Sometimes that path forward holds a lot of unknowns to it. It might mean that things have to change in our lives. It might mean we have to give some things up. It might mean that our relationships have to change. It might mean that our careers change. It might mean that our social status is different now. Sometimes it's scary because we just don't know what's on the other side of it, and so we don't want to take that first step. But the pathway to your deliverance is only found in taking a step of faith and obedience through the waters God is opening. We find deliverance as we take those steps. And there's a powerful word that comes through here that we learn from these verses, is that God was not only doing a work to deliver his people, but he was also revealing something about his purposes, in that his glory was being put on display. If I can say it this way, the Red Sea exhibits God's definitive purposes and power to all. As you read this account, multiple times you see this coming out. We see the Israelites pass through the waters, and the Egyptians come after them. Talk about a bold move. The Egyptians come after them through the water, and it says the waters crash in around them, and they are swept into the sea. When God does a work at the Red Sea, he is showing that he is all-powerful. He is the one that is Lord, and he is revealing his glory. And we see this coming through in these verses. Verse 18, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Verse 24, during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army, threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them and against Egypt. They recognize it. And then that definitive verse 30. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. God had a purpose, and his glory was being revealed through the work of delivering his people and bringing them out, and he was showing his power through it. Listen, there is actually a witness and a testimony to God's greatness through our lives of obedience when we act and take that step of faith to walk through that he's making a way. Well, there's one last lesson that I want us to look at here, and it's in the last verse, verse 31. It says, and when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. The Red Sea builds trust in the deliverer and confidence in him for the future. The Israelites saw this miraculous work that was taking place. And God was doing it in their behalf, and it was building trust in their lives for who this God is that was actually leading them out. And the same is true for us. As God does these definitive points of deliverance in our lives and makes a way for us, it builds trust in our lives to know that I can trust him. One of the reasons why God had the Israelites celebrate the feasts as part of the regular rhythms of their lives, these celebrations, it's because it reminded them of the work that God had done in their past as they faced their present. That trust is what helps us face the future. And so I know that if I can see God work and I can trust him here, that I know when I face the next trouble, when I face the next Red Sea, I can trust him here because he's a trustworthy God and because he has proven himself to be the deliverer. And the beautiful thing about it is that it's all found within this amazing, loving, holy relationship with him. And so the Living Sent challenge this week is simply this. Be still and stand firm in trust as God delivers you to the promises and places that he is sending you. Would you please pray with me? God, I just want to say thank you for your word. And thank you for the ways that you prove yourself to be faithful. God, thank you for the stories that we have of those that have gone before and hearing the stories of how you have acted in their behalf. God, I pray that even as we have gone through this text, you would continue to be speaking and moving in our midst. In Jesus' name, amen.